Good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. And welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO. I personally, as a member of Congress, visited Sana'a, Yemen, a few years back at a more hopeful time and met with leaders of opposition parties, and certainly many of us over the years have wanted Yemen to turn out right. Today we will see what people a lot more informed than I think about all this. I want to express my specific gratitude that Mohammed al-Basha is here with us today to represent his country and his embassy. Thank you very much for coming. And to recognize many Wilson Cabinet Council and corporate supporters in the audience. As I'm sure many of you know, our own embassy in Sana'a, which I did visit, has closed, though I hope it will open again soon. In a region increasingly compromised by terror, Yemen's partnership has been vital to our country in combating some of the world's most dangerous extremists. We hosted President Hadi here in 2012 when the outlook was so much brighter. The U.S.-Yemeni relationship was strong. Sectarian conflict has done serious harm, and it is fair to worry now that civil war could make Yemen the Gulf's own Syria. Of great concern is that Iran's own leaders have suggested they intend to wield the Houthis like another Hezbollah against Sunni rivals, although that's a more complicated story. I know that because I was talking to Robert Worth about an hour ago, and he will tell you it's a more complicated story. It's essential that Yemen not become a casualty of proxy conflict. The idea of a regional war between Shiites and Sunnis is exactly the narrative that ISIL and al-Qaeda used to recruit. Again, the situation may be more complicated, and there may be a way forward that will surprise and impress us. Without a solution for strife and insecurity, extremists could hatch in Yemen the dangerous collaborations they've started designing in Syria. Imagine if Ibrahim al-Assiri were to connect with foreign fighters holding clean Western passports. Well, that's very interesting. It's a call to the mosque. An inclusive political solution is vital. That is what we've sought for years. We've seen in Syria that terror groups thrive in a vacuum. We've seen in Iraq that legitimacy and security depend on respect for all communities. This is first and foremost a Yemeni crisis. I think everyone understands that. The West doesn't have all the answers, certainly not, or even a counter-narrative that is adequate to persuade some kid in the boonies of Yemen to not strap on a suicide vest. Too many Yemenis have never had contact with the U.S. except via drone. Without dictating solutions, the United States should provide the support Yemenis need for the solutions they choose themselves. That's how to win the argument and the peace. We're thrilled with the panel we've assembled today to frame the challenge, and I would like to introduce our moderator, Robert Worth, who will introduce the other panelists. Robert is a public policy scholar with the Center's Middle East program. He's also worked as Beirut bureau chief for the New York Times and contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. You probably saw him on page A1 of the Times last week with his article entitled, "At Risk of Fragmenting, Yemen Poses Dangers to the U.S." That's for sure. He'll guide us through a thoughtful conversation on the region today, but before turning this over to Robert, want to recognize the fearless leader of our Middle East program, Hala Esfandiari, in the center seat here. And I want to thank Hala for bringing us both the scholars and the programs over so many years that have educated so many of us. So please welcome Robert Worth.
Thank you, Jane. For people who've been writing and thinking about the Houthis for years, it's a really strange thing to be at a panel conference in Washington, D.C. about them. I remember in, I think it was 2007 or 2008, attending a trial of a Yemeni journalist, Khaiwani, who was on trial for having supported the Houthis. Back then, they were this strange, very opaque rebel group up in the northwestern corner of Yemen, and even talking about them got you in trouble. Now they essentially run the country. And the past few months, we've seen a lot about them in the news. I'll just briefly review. And they've been gaining strength for years now, especially since 2011. But in September, the Houthis overran the capital, Sana'a, commanding important government sites and forcing their rivals to flee, including Ali Muhsin, who was for years and years, both a rival and to Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president, and a key military leader who had been an important part of the war, the intermittent war against the Houthis that lasted from 2004 until 2010. And then in the fall, we saw more and more violence by Al-Qaeda in Yemen, terrible bombings in the south and in the capital. In January, there was an attack on a police academy that killed 38 people. In January, also, the Kouachi brothers carried out their attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris, and Al-Qaeda in Yemen, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as they call themselves, claim credit for it. At least one of those brothers was trained in Yemen. And then just last week we had clashes outside President Hadi's residence in Sana'a, and the Houthis pressing him from war concessions, and then he stepped down, possibly calling their bluff. So Yemen is rudderless, and all kinds of questions arise that I hope we can address today. I'll just mention a few of them that interest me. What exactly is the Iranian role? Jane alluded to that, but what should the United States do, and what can the United States do? I think the diplomatic options are very limited at this point. Do the Houthis hope to control the entire country, and did Hadi's resignation reveal a miscalculation on their part? What is the Houthi political and social agenda? Again, that's been very opaque for many years. Some of their spokesmen call them liberals, but revolutionaries in the 2011 sense. But their core leadership is said to be much, much more conservative. How serious now is the threat of southern secession, and what would it mean given the fragmented state of the South? I ask that partly because the question arises, can the Houthis manage the southern issue at all? So I want to introduce now our panelists. We have Peter Salisbury, who is a journalist who's been based in Yemen for Reuters, Al Jazeera, and Foreign Policy. He's written a lot of excellent stuff recently on the finances of Yemen and on the Houthis and the Iranian role. Charles Schmitz, who is a professor at Towson University and an affiliated scholar at the Middle East Institute. He's worked on Yemen for many years. And Mohammed al-Basha from the Yemeni embassy here in Washington, D.C., who has a lifetime of experience to draw on. And we're going to start with Peter.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for having me here this afternoon. Most people who watch Yemen will tell you that it's a very, very complex country. It's very complicated. And what I'm going to try and do in the next 10 minutes is make it a little bit more complicated, if that's okay. I'm going to talk about how we've gone over the past year from the end of the National Dialogue Conference, which almost exactly coincided as an anniversary of the first year of the end of the National Dialogue, with Hadi announcing his resignation. How do we move from this really euphoric moment a year ago to the point where we have no president, no prime minister, no government, and no real understanding of who holds the balance of power in Yemen? And the answer has a lot to do with two separate yet intertwined issues of coalition building and of negotiation in Yemen. And when we look at Yemen, we tend to see it as a lawless state, a place where there are no laws, and we see a lot of intractable actors who are incapable of acting outside of self-interest. And while that is broadly correct, there are rules within Yemen. There are rules of procedure, rules of operation. And what these have to do with are building enough power for me, my group, and the people around me, with other people who I may not be ideologically aligned with, but where we have common goals or we have common foes. And what we've really seen over the past year, since Rabbuh Mansur Hadi announced the end of the National Dialogue, is the emergence of a coalition of different forces who have had several aims in common. And the people that I'm talking about really are people from the northwest of Yemen, people who've always really held the balance of power in the unitary Yemeni state. And those are the Houthis, about who we've heard a great deal, but we actually know very little. Then we've got Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, and the hardcore around him within the GPC, the General People's Congress, his party, which has been the traditional ruling party in Yemen. And then we have tribal groups and smaller armed groups in Yemen who for a long time have lived in tribal areas controlled by people loosely affiliated to a coalition of forces of conservative tribal Islamist and military leaders who we talk about often as Islah. It's a little bit more complex than that. So realistically, for those of you who know Yemen, we're talking about Ali Mohsen al-Ahmar and his 1st Armoured Division. Ali Mohsen was seen as being someone who was connected with the Muslim Brotherhood, and in 2011 he came out in support of the revolution, as did Islah, Yemen's main Sunni Islamist political party, and as did the Hashid Tribal Confederation, so a confederation of tribes which are led by the Al-Ahmars, or were until recently at the very least, and who have been seen as being converts to Sunnism, although that again is a vast oversimplification. And in the Al-Ahmar tribal areas, a lot of people for a very long time were very unhappy with the way that they were treated by the tribal and the Islamist leadership in the area. Many people in Yemen have resented, meanwhile, for a very long time, the treatment of various different groups by Ali Mohsen, who was a very powerful military general. And then there are people who have seen Islah as this force not for good but for bad in the country. So you've got these three different groups really, where you've got people who are just pissed off, you've got people who are opposed to Islah Ali Mohsen because of historical reasons. So the Houthis have really re-engineered their narrative over the last 2-3 years. Once upon a time, they talked about how the state and the Saleh regime tried to oppress and crush them. But since the revolution and since in 2011 and since the ouster of Saleh, what we've really seen is the emergence of a new narrative, which I feel is quite telling of this coalition, where they start talking about how this coalition of conservative forces, the Islamist tribes, the Islah and Ali Mohsen, were really the guys who led the fight against them between 2004 and 2010. There's some truth to that, but it certainly isn't the whole story. Saleh, meanwhile, has been very, very angry, of course, for the last 3-4 years about the fact that he was effectively thrown out of power by people who had been part of his regime for a number of years, this same conservative bloc. And what we've seen is the two groups come together, first and foremost, to get rid of these guys, and secondly, to try and alter the outcomes of the National Dialogue Conference to create an outcome more amenable to their interests. And what we saw over the past year is the Houthis first gaining position by taking over tribal areas, key geographical positions in the north of the country, and that got very little interest in the international media, this small militia. So by the time they reached Sana'a, by which point they'd gained support at a ground level, they built things up from the grassroots, they'd also managed to work out a nice coalition with Saleh, who still had a great deal of influence over the military, that they were in a very, very strong bargaining position. But the issue here, it comes to this second point that I made at the beginning, which is that a lot of time in Yemen, what we're used to is people positioning, people starting a fight, then pulling back and working out a deal for themselves. And when they reached the outskirts of Sana'a, the expectation was that this coalition of forces would then bring things to a pause, work out a deal, and bring themselves into politics. Instead, we saw fighting break out, and we saw the Houthis and Saleh in coalition, I will argue, working to make sure that this coalition of conservative forces, Islah, the tribes, and Ali Mohsen, and the military units around him, no longer posed a threat to them in the longer term. But they were so successful that they ended up taking over Sana'a. And what we've seen since then is this issue for them of being in the strongest possible bargaining position and not really needing to pay any attention to the outcomes of this National Dialogue Conference, this 10-month series of peace talks that were held in Yemen and ended just over a year ago. Now, that was the first time the Houthis had participated in national politics, and they got a lot of concessions out of it, but there were certain things within the National Dialogue Conference, for example, a decision to move towards a federal model of governance that they weren't very happy with. But at that point, they weren't in a bargaining position to really push back. So they came out publicly and they started complaining, and particularly their Politburo, their political arm in Sana'a, started complaining very loudly about this decision to move towards a federal model of governance. And what we've seen over the past year is them building up to a point where they're in a position where there is really no balancing and opposing force as long as they are in this coalition with Saleh and the various tribes who are allied to him and various people who have decided that they wanted to get rid of this conservative bloc. And that brings us more or less to where we are today. But now we're seeing them in this very interesting position where they're overreaching, where their coalition of forces is in such a position of relative strength in that there is no other force that can really counterbalance them, that they can do more or less what we like. And I think that they're getting a little bit too excited, but they're also making some pretty bad moves. So when we talk about what happened last week, it's being described as a coup, and in many ways I would argue that what we've been seeing in Yemen since June, July, August of last year is a slow-burning coup, is a coup in slow motion, where people are gradually taking over the apparatus of the state. But the thing is, each time they get to a new point, they realize that they can go a little bit further. And what we saw last week was overreach on the part of the Houthis, but I think also possibly the beginning of the split of the coalition of forces that has allowed the Houthis to be the most visible element of the takeover of the state. So the draft constitution was finished in December. Around 2 weeks ago, the chief of staff to the president was bringing that draft constitution to a committee formed at the end of the national dialogue to have them look at the draft and pass it so it could be put to referendum. The Houthis were led to believe that this draft constitution contained provisions for 6 regional federal states, which is something that they oppose deeply, and they decided to abduct the chief of staff. In return, The president and the head of the military, Subehi, sent the presidential guard out onto the streets of Sana'a in order to reclaim the city. And the Houthis, again, retaliated. Now, what happened after that is actually largely down to conjecture, because it's important to remember that the Houthis are not the only people in Sana'a. And my understanding, and no one is really going to get the right or wrong answer out of this, Yemen is deeply opaque right now, and good information is very, very hard to come by. But my understanding is you had an issue of two different groups, really the Saleh loyalists encircling various areas, including the National Security Bureau and the Political Security Office, as well as the Presidential Palace and the home of the president, and the Houthis feeling that they had also to step in. And this really points out the issue and the point that we've reached at, where you've got these two groups where neither wants to be seen as being behind the other and egging each other on to go a little bit further. But now that Hadi has resigned, which the Houthis didn't want, they wanted a weak president in place. They wanted someone who they could dictate terms to. They find themselves in a position where it's possible for Saleh to put someone that he feels is amenable to his interests into place. And at the moment we have two conversations going on. One is about a presidential council, which I believe is something that's being negotiated by the UN with the various different political parties at the moment. We've also got this question of the existing constitution in Yemen, which, according to Saleh's party, means that the Speaker of the House, a Saleh loyalist, becomes interim president if Hadi is removed. And then we have the Houthis who are pushing for their own version of a military presidential council. So now we're at a point where the interests are diverging. And what we're likely to see, to my mind, in the coming months is new positioning, is people trying to work out their relative strength to each other and strike a bargain internally. And that's where we're left at today.
Thank you, Peter. Charles.
From there. I want to do a little bit more with the Houthi. Who are they? Where they came from? Let me just make a couple of key points. I think one, the Houthi is a changing organization. It's not the same thing that it was when it began, and I think it's also not itself not sure what it is at this point. And some of the confusion comes from confusion within the Houthi movement. So just to start, I mean, the Houthi movement really began as a college students' defense of Zaydism, revival of Zaydism, in the late 80s and early 90s, and they from there. They were counteracting influences that were coming from Saudi Arabia and from the Republican government, the Wahhabism and Salafism that was up in the north. And at some point, Hussein al-Houthi, coming from Hizb al-Haq, which was a Zaydi political party formed after unity, got involved. And he's the one that really militarized the group. Now, of course, Yemen, everybody's militarized. But he's the one that began to say we need to take a more defensive position. And he's the one that also provoked the president. He's the one that came up with the chant, death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews, long live Islam. And that chant is not meant to be anti-American. It was meant to stick a thorn in the side of the president, who at the time, after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, was defending the U.S. embassy, was defending his relationship on the war on terror with the Bush administration. And so the thorn was to say, we are authentically Yemeni. We don't serve foreign interests. We're not beholden to the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, and we're not beholden to the Americans. We are authentically Yemeni. And the thorn worked. The president reacted and went after him, and that's when the conflicts began. The conflicts introduce another dynamic in the movement, in the sense that now the movement is dealing with tribal and military relations up in the north. They're successful. They're successful largely because the Yemeni military is split in itself and is fighting as much each other as they are fighting the Houthi. But this gains them lots of credibility within Yemen as a force that can stand up to the Saleh regime. So everybody who is upset with the Saleh regime as Peter alluded to, the Houthi began to create a coalition of those rejecting the main components of the Saleh regime, and they gained lots of support. And it's important to recognize that, because a lot of the people who are rejecting Houthi rule right now supported the Houthi in their fights against the Saleh regime and supported them in the national dialogue as well. Then, as I see it, the Saleh regime, it had three failures, and the two big failures was the south and the far north. Both are regions that were subject to war. Both are regions that lost wars. Both are regions that the Saleh couldn't bring into his coalition. He couldn't bring into his network. He couldn't incorporate them politically into it, and they remained outside. So there's two large areas of Yemen that are outside of Saleh's coalition, patronage network, his political group. They're putting pressure on it, and then the final straw is the regime splits in two with Ali Muqsim's defection and Islah's defection, and we have the Arab Spring. The national dialogue, which of course is internationally backed by the Gulf states principally, but also the UN, of course it's UN backed, and the United States and the Europeans are backing this. It basically holds the Saleh regime together, where it has split in half. It sort of brings them back together again. And then through the mechanism of the national dialogue, it brings the Southerners, or tries to bring the Southerners in and bring the Ansar Allah, brings the Houthis into the dialogue. That's the transition period from 2012 to 2014. And there, Ansar Allah, of course, they participated in the national dialogue, and they were a major focus of the national dialogue. And they, as opposed to the southern, the Iraq, the Ansar Allah fully participated and could make decisions, and they came up with their stances and whatnot. The transitional government failed. The transitional government failed largely because the competition that was going underneath, the power blocks underneath, were fighting each other rather than governing. So you had Saleh and his supporters, and then you had Islah. And Islah at this point is feeling very good, like they're going to win the next set of elections. They're feeling very powerful, and there's a lot of competition within the institutions about trying to gain influence in the institutions in order to position themselves best for the coming elections. Government basically doesn't happen. If you ask ordinary Yemenis, they say the government is gone. Has been gone since 2011. People often ask me, is the Yemeni state going to fail? And I would say, well, how would you know it if it did? Because there is no state, really. And that's the way Yemenis have felt for the last. And that gradually built up to a point where people on the street had little interest in the national dialogue. They felt it was irrelevant to their lives. And the situation was deteriorating. The security situation was very bad. And the economic situation was very bad. And there's a lot of resentment against the whole process. I point to January 2014, where it seems to be Ansar Allah took a new stance. They took aggressive stance. They said, okay, look, this interim government's going to fail. It's not going to be able to pull off its transition, and we're going to step in and we're going to shape it directly. This is the point where the question of its relationship with Iran comes in. I see this is the one place where the Iranians have had a big impact, and that is funding. Because in Yemen, in order to build militias, to build these coalitions, you got to pay people. Yemen's a poor country. It's not coming from taxes in Sada. There's not enough money in Sada to fund that kind of a movement. So that's the big impact that the Iranians have had, in my view, on it. And it begins then. They take Dar Hadith, they take the Damaj, the Salafi place there. Nobody paid attention to it. Okay, these are long enemies. They got rid of them. Good. Then they moved down to Amran. Amran was a key place because Amran is the seat of one of the key units of Ali Muqsim's supporters in the military. Islah was big in Amran, and the Al-Ahmar family of that leadership of the Hashid Tribal Confederation was located there. Everybody said, Amran, red line, they'll never take it. Psh, they took it. Apparently with support with tribes that were supporting Ali Abdallah Saleh, and they move further south, and then they move into Sana'a. Now, when they take Sana'a, they see themselves, they portray themselves as revolutionaries. They say, we are revolutionaries, we are a continuation of the 2011 revolution, and we are here to implement the national dialogue. We are here to make sure that the national dialogue happens, that the outcomes are enforced. And so they set up committees that were sort of going into all the ministries and overseeing them. And they went in and replaced, they incorporated into the police forces, and they incorporated themselves into the military and like this. They very much need the national state. And this is kind of what I call the schizophrenic behavior. This is the learning process that they're going through. They want to have all the guns in the North. The guns of the North were turned against them. They're very insecure. They want to be the biggest gun in the North. So they are now. They've taken all the guns. They got a hold of the missile divisions in the south of Sana'a now. So they have Scud missiles even now. So they have all the guns now. But what they didn't realize is that didn't seem to have it in mind was they were also going to have to govern. And in Yemen, there is this, sort of power, assertion of power. So when they went in and they blew up all the headquarters of the Islah party, kind of said, well, this is the way it goes in Yemen. In 1994, Islah blew up all the Ishtiraki, headquarters in the south and whatnot. So now, payback. They're getting their own houses blown up, okay? This is the way Yemen works. I mean, Ali Abdullah Saleh blew up lots of people's houses, right? And they saw that, and this is the way they understood power. They were going to go blow up their opponent's houses. They were going to take the biggest gun and whatnot. But they forgot the other part, which is the state. And the state is important in Yemen. It's not just, all these coalitions of tribes, but the state is important. And the state's important because the state brings all of Yemen's diverse components together. And at this point, the Houthi have totally alienated everybody because they came in as the forces that were going to build the state when they are actually, undermining the state. They are the ones that are going in and doing things by force rather than by process, by institution building. And so they've alienated the entire southern and eastern area, and they've stepped back. Right now, this decision-making part, they're going to try and somehow incorporate themselves into a broader state. The key factor for me, the key thing I'm looking for right now, is not what's happening in Sana'a, but what's happening in the east. Because the military forces, they've amassed their forces. The Islah and tribal forces of the eastern, in the Marib and Jawfis, have amassed their forces. The Saudis have said that's a red line, and they've massed their forces. And so it's like, they're backing for these forces. And so if that comes to war, we're looking at a big civil war. And the key is that the oil is out there. That's where all the oil is. And the Marib tribes have turned it off. They've stopped the flow of oil. Will that be a negotiated settlement, or will it be a military one? If it's a military one, the Houthi will win the initial battle, but they'll lose the war. And it'll mean lots of blood for Yemen. If they're able to hold off and keep it in the political process, I think there's still some hope for a future of Yemen.
Thanks, Charles. Mohammed.
Hello. Good morning. It's humbling to speak after Peter and Professor Charles. Difficult times. We're at a point where I remember my first meeting with Bobby a few years ago was about the Houthis. And we sat down and we were scratching our heads, trying to analyze what's this movement. Was it the next Hezbollah in Yemen? Was it something just originated in the country? So I'm going to be very short in my speech, and I would like to engage the audience more than talking. I'll give you updates of what's happening right now. Yesterday, at the end of the fourth talks that Jamal bin Umar, a UN envoy, is hosting at Mozambique with the various political players, it seems that we're heading towards a presidential council. There's an agreement by all the players on the presidential council, but there's a problem with the number of representatives in the council, the time frame, how long would this council stay in power, what are the priorities for the council, how are we going to process this council, is it going to go through the parliament, or is it going to be just by political consensus? It seems that there's a lot of divisions, to the point that when I actually walked into the building, I was informed that the GPC pulled out from the meeting. And they pulled out because they want to ensure that this process goes through the parliament. And in the parliament, there's two articles, Article 115, 116. 115 means that the President, Hadi, his resignation will be accepted. At this point, the President's resignation has not been officially accepted. So legally speaking, he's still the head of the state. He's not on active duty as a head of state or commander-in-chief, but legally he's still the President. And in Article 116, that will give the power to the parliament, and the Speaker of the House with his two deputies will be the commanders-in-chief, and within 90 days will hold elections. Iraq pulled out today too. Iraq feels frustrated that it seems that when the Houthis besieged a lot of southern officials in the capital, and a lot of people who were personally targeted, whether the president, the prime minister, chief of staff, Mr. Mubarak, and other ministers, were southerners. So the southerners feel that the Houthi movement was looking down at them, was not giving them that respect that they should be getting. The Salafis, of course, have historical problems with the Houthis, so one day they're in, one day they're out. JMP seems at this point that they're moving along with the Houthis regarding the Presidential Council, but the situation is fluid. It's changing day by day. I started with this because I want to make sure that people understand this is not a Sunni Shia war in Yemen. It has nothing to do with Shias and Sunni. This is a political crisis with political resolutions, hopefully. I spoke to every representatives of the factions that were involved in discussions today. They all said that there was problems, but they all reassured me that they're moving towards the political resolution. No one wants to pick up the guns and fight because, like Professor Charles says, that the Houthis and others know that they could win short-term battles, but in the long term, no one's going to win. And my consistent advice to Ansarullah and the Houthis is, looking at the history of Yemen, not a single group was able to manage and control and dominate the country. And if you use force, it's not sustainable. Why did we end up in this place? I think Peter and Professor Charles mentioned a lot of the points. I'm going to just quickly do some highlights. I think the first one is in 2011, the former government or former regime elements started acting as opposition, although they still were in the government. And then you have the opposition or traditional opposition powers started to act or continue to act as an opposition. So you had everybody who was in the government acting as an opposition, and nobody was really, it was confusing. I mean, you will talk to officials about certain things that had to do with my job, and people were, acting like they were opposition. I'm like, no, you're the decision maker now. You make the decision, like not them. You're the them now. The second problem is mistrust. Everybody mistrusts the other side, even within the parties, even within the factions. The third point was the strong loyalty to the clan and to the party and to the faction, which was, I think, unfortunately, due to the weak identity of the state of the country, that the smaller identity always dominated how people looked at things. So people were always loyal to the clan and to the tribe and to the party more than anything else. NDC, one of my big criticism of NDC is one of the important things that they should have discussed from point one was the federalism issue and regional issue. So that should have been discussed from day one, not at the last phase. And I think being a devil's advocate, people would say they wanted to leave that at the end because it was such a difficult topic and they didn't want to start with it because it would have ruined the process itself. The silent majority. I think the majority of the Yemenis are the silent majority. They're not sure what to do. They traditionally would look forward to speak about their position via elections. And at this point, I think, like Professor said, Charles, in 2013, Islah thought if they ran elections, they would have probably dominated the parliament. I don't agree, but at this point, we don't know who would dominate the elections. 2 months ago, perhaps the Houthis would have dominated. But at this point, I think the people are just frustrated with all the parties out there, and people are just sick and tired of everybody just trying to push an agenda that's not that doesn't have cohesion. What troubles me is that we're not looking at the bigger picture. The bigger picture is Yemen is heading towards economic crisis. A serious fiscal crisis already began. And I always say that it's very hard to define Yemen as a failed state or a dysfunctional state. It's a Yemeni state. That's how it is. That's how it works. But it will become a failed state the day that we're not able to pay salaries, the day that the soldiers are not being able to get money, the public servants stop refusing going to work. The past week, I was surprised and impressed that a lot of my colleagues, even under gunfire, went to work and continued to offer basic services and to continue doing what they're doing, considering the circumstances. Others won't do that, but it shows the resiliency of the people. The Houthis at this point today dominate the scene in most of the northern provinces, especially in the capital. But The big challenge is in Marib, is in the Shafi'i traditional areas, in the central regions where I come from, in Taiz and Ib. They had strong popular support in Taiz, but it came to the point when people saw what happened in Sana'a, people were like, oh, never mind about that. We're going to be in line with them. And the South, I think the South, today, this morning, armed southern groups try to occupy and seize a battalion, and then the brigade sent reinforcement and they pushed them back. So everybody see what the Houthis did as an example of setting precedent. This is how you should do violence, capture properties, capture bases, and that's going to work because it will be the status quo, and everybody apparently in the international community is realpolitik. They will just play along. In the long term, what I fear is if the Houthis are not able to form a political consensus in managing the transition period or what's remaining from the transition period, the GCC and the Saudis are not going to be strong supporters of any Houthi-dominated government. They've made that clear. Today, the GCC made a statement supporting President Hadi and rejecting any possibility of a presidential council. The international community, I think the core of the Houthi argument is the PNP, the Peace and National Participation Agreement, but the international community sees that as an agreement between President Hadi and with the Houthis. And if President Hadi is no longer in the picture, then PNP is not going to be as important as the GCC initiative, as the UN Security Council resolutions, as the National Dialogue Conference. So I think the National Dialogue Conference is something that we could rally people around at this point and not just focus on. So it seems that each faction focuses on a certain initiative or a political agreement that would serve them the best. But I think the national dialogue is something that we could work on. The economic crisis in the last 3 quarters, we lost $600 million from the oil attacks in Marib and other parts of the country, and that's 60% of the government revenues comes from oil. The donors' pledges to Yemen, I think at this point, out of the $7+ billion that was promised and pledged to Yemen, we only have absorbed less than 38%. So there's still 16% of the donor money there. So there's money there, but people are not going to invest in this situation. A regional diplomat described this to me. He's like, I'm seeing a building that's collapsing, and you're telling me to invest in it. And my sense is telling me that I would not invest in this building, let the building collapse, and then rebuild. And in my counter argument, I'm like, yes, but if the building collapses, there are neighbors around the building. And when the building goes down, it will damage the neighbors too. So it's not a clear-cut position. And the vacuum. There's no security vacuum to the extent that people are reporting it at this point. It seems that the popular committees and the military and the police and the tribes are managing the security of their areas. But if the Houthis continue expanding, then AQAP is going to have a chance to recruit more from the tribes who are traditionally against the Houthis. And then we're going to have perhaps other militants like ISIS already is trying to have a footprint in the country, and other groups are trying to, perhaps another sort of counterinsurgency is going to form. So it's a very disturbing, chaotic solution. And the last point is, what will be the future of U.S.-Yemeni relationship in a Houthi-dominated government? I think so far everybody is panicking and freaking out with the recent reports and analysis. I always advise journalists that don't rush into coming up with statements and positions. Let the dust settle down the next 40 hours. I think by Sunday night we're going to have a very good idea of what will happen. Why Sunday night? Because today the Houthis started their we called it the Expanded National Congress, which is supposed to be. It reminded me of former President Saleh General People Congress in '82. Where it brought different factions under one umbrella, and it's trying to find street legitimacy. But I think at this point, this Congress is pressuring all the political players. You have 48 hours, come up with a solution. Otherwise, we're going to step in. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to all three of you. A lot of great detail here. And what I'd like to do is back up a bit, and I'm going to first ask the panelists to discuss a little further, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience, including from some of the overflow people. So one thing I would like to press a little further is, who the Houthis really are. What do they want? You've all said something about that. Mohammed, you mentioned that it's not really a sectarian problem, and it's true. I mean, sectarianism has not historically been an issue in Yemen, and yet there's clearly an issue. It's partly, as I understand it, almost a caste problem as much as a sectarian problem. The Houthis come from these Hashemite Zaydis, that is to say, not only Zaydis but also tracing their origins to the Prophet, who were a kind of a aristocratic group in old Yemen, pre-62 Yemen, and the imams, the essentially monarchs who ran the country, were derived from that caste. So there's resentment against them. And the Houthis have taken that and sort of revivalist Zaydism and made a kind of a new ideological soup out of it with, elements of Hezbollah, all kinds of accusations that I think are mostly not true, but certainly some people have converted to Shiism up there, and that's added to the uncertainty about it. And again, they're clearly pragmatic in some ways, and that's a good thing. I mean, allying with Ali Abdullah Saleh is not, in the eyes of many people, a beautiful thing, but it shows that they're willing to negotiate. Why are they against the 6-region federalism plan? And I'm interested in knowing also a little bit more, whatever we know, about how they make decisions and what some of their long-term goals for Yemen are. Before I press you guys individually about that, the second question is maybe simpler, but possibly of higher priority to a lot of people here. What are the U.S. options in this context? They seem to me to be awfully limited. I mean, we have the potential, as you were saying, for a serious civil war in Yemen. We have these conservative forces out in Marib who are seriously opposed to what the Houthis are doing in the country. The Saudis seem pretty inflexible at this point. Who's going to bridge this gap? And does the U.S. at this point have the diplomatic dexterity to do that? So first question first. Peter, maybe I can ask you, because you've written a little bit about this question of how they make decisions, how they feel about federalism. What are their goals?
So I think the important thing to remember with the Houthis as they stand currently is that Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the leader of the movement, was not the guy that was initially seen as being the big man among the Houthis. He was a very young man when his older brother died. And his eventual ascension to the leadership. There's a narrative at the moment which says Hussein al-Houthi dies 2004, Abdul Malik takes over. That's actually false. Another local tribal leader who was not part of the al-Houthi family took over day-to-day management of the group, did not do very well in the next 2 wars. And it was only really at the end of the second war, when Abdul Malik had done well as a field commander, that he was put in place. He's this quiet young guy, very scholarly, very religious, but doesn't really have the charisma of his brother. And we've only really seen him as a personality, someone appearing on TV, developing into someone who's a good public speaker and who makes coherent sense over the last 2-3 years. So what we've got in terms of Abdul Malik is someone who's taking over his brother's reins, but largely on the basis that he's a decent field commander and that he's a smart guy and he can bring people around him. And then you look at the people around him. There's a core inner circle around him about whom we know very little, people he trusts very much, and they're generally limited to people in Sada who haven't gone out with the movement that we call the Houthis. And that's the inner layer that I call the Houthis, and these guys are pretty religious. Everyone outside of that layer is to a varying degree much more pragmatic about things. And the coalition of forces that we've seen taking over northwest Yemen over the last 3-4 years has really been this odd mixture of people who are ideologically on the Houthi side, who generally identify as people who can work with them. They're Zaydi, and they're tribal guys, so they feel like they can work with these guys. So you've got a lot of the tribes from Sada working with the Houthis. What I've been told by a number of different people from inside Sada is, look, people will work with the Houthis as long as they serve their interests, but the second they start screwing up and people start associating me with this group, I'm going to walk away, and the Houthis are going to be left as actually this very small core group. And what they've done is they've been able to build up this strong coalition of forces. But again, you've got this young guy who's been very isolated from the outside world his entire life, even more so now, drives from place to place on a day-to-day basis, gets his information from his field commanders, not all of who are ideologically on page with him. So they're a very disjointed movement, and it feels a lot like they have moved on a day-to-day basis, and they make up policy on the hoof. And it's very important to remember that, I think. Sorry, that's...
Yeah, if we could just, you two could very, very briefly address that, and then we're running out of time, so we'll need to take some questions.
Sure. I describe the Houthis' strategy as two words. Why not? So it's very simple, and it's not complicated, and this is why the Houthi is a young, evolving movement, and we as students of traditional public policy, when we look at the Houthis and we try to put them in certain formulas, they don't fit in because it's new, it's something raw. And Abd al-Malik al-Houthi, I think put it this way, a lot of people now are having a hard time working with the popular committees or dealing with them, and that's because when we look at the Yemen's population, 26 million, 60% under the age of 24, the popular committees are formed mainly from these young kids who for 6 years were under the barrage of missiles and artillery and tribal and government forces attacking them. So these are, in the words of Ali al-Bukhayti, a former Houthi official who split recently and wrote, he's like, this is the monster you created. These are the sons of orphans. These are the people who lived in IDP camps for years. These are the people who've never seen the inside of a school, of a university, of a clinic, of a hospital. And so the government, the people of Yemen, the international community, I think, forgot about the Houthis for so long. And they kept evolving, and Abd al-Malik the Houthi and the clan became a center point for them to rally about, like a hope, something religious connotation, like the Pope. Not to compare Abd al-Malik to the Pope, but a figurehead that people rallied around. And this is what we have today. We have a struggle between the two main factions of the movement. It's the popular committees, which is kind of like the armed military wing of the movement, and then you have the political bureau. The political bureau have members people that you could work with, but at this point, it seems that the military side of the movement is dominating. And when you mentioned the Saudis earlier, the Saudis are very sensitive about the Houthis for a good reason. Houthi, in the history of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, are the only movement that came into Saudi territory, killed Saudi soldiers, seized Saudi weaponry. So this is a very sensitive topic of them. But at the end of the day, we all need to no longer pretend that the Houthi is a problem that's going to vaporize and disappear. They're part of the society, and we have to learn how to coexist and work with them.
Okay, Charles, and I have to ask you to be brief because we need.
Well, let me just make a couple of points. One, on the Zaydiness of the Houthis, that Zaydi aristocracy that you're talking about, they don't all support the Houthis. So it's not a sectarian thing in that sense. And the second, Zaydism, as all religions, goes through evolution. And so a few things that they've done, for example, the Ashura and also the big celebration in Sana'a of the birth of the Prophet, that's not traditional Zaydi practice. That's something new. But what they're doing there is sort of establishing their dominance. They show, by celebrating that, they show their dominance. It's Zaydism on the fly a little bit. It's evolving.
Great. Okay. Questions? Amal Mudlali. Go ahead.
Thank you. Amal Mudlali with the Wilson Center. My question is to your last point about the role of Iran and when did the Houthis convert to Shiism. Could you please, all of you, address the issue of the role of Iran in this, and especially that Hussein Houthi, the father, lived in Iran when Saleh chased him out, and he converted to Ithna Ashariya. This is what everybody says. And as you mentioned, for the first time in Yemen's history, they celebrated Ashura in the streets of Sana'a this year. So could you please talk about the role of Iran, and is this going to be a proxy war between the region and Iran inside Yemen? Thank you.
A couple of points about that. The Iranians want influence in Yemen, and they don't care who it is. They deal with Ali Salmi Bey, they deal with communists, they deal with student activists. I mean, if you were in 2011, if you were in Sana'a, you could just raise your hand and you could get a ticket to Tehran to go for training, and to have a good time. So it's not the Shiism is not the determinant thing. When the Houthi conflict first broke out in 2004, the Iranians would say, well, we sympathize with our oppressed brothers. We want to defend our oppressed Shiite brothers and whatnot. But the Shiism part was a small part of it. The actual practice of Zaydiism in Yemen, sure, there's some people have converted to Twelvism. The Imamiyya, which is the Iranian version of it. But the Zaydis, it's very much an indigenous practice, and it's not sort of replicating the Iranian Shiism or something like that. My quick take is that the Houthi are going to do what they want, and their key objective is security. They were under the gun in the north, and they're going to make sure that they've got the guns for the future. And if the Iranians said no, they would say yes. I mean, it's a Houthi agenda. It's a domestic agenda. It doesn't have anything to do with the Iranians.
Marina, yeah.
Marina Atawi, also with the Wilson Center. We have talked about Iran. We have not talked about Saudi Arabia, for a country where there is no money, essentially, and financing for whatever fighting takes place comes from the outside. Saudi Arabia is important. Can you tell us more about it?
I can speak to that quickly if you want.
I'll be very simple. Without Saudi support, the economy will collapse.
And let me add one more thing about it. In '62, after the revolution, the Saudis were backing these guys, the Houthi, right? Not the Houthi, but the Zaydis, right? They were backing the Zaydis. It's not a sectarian issue. And in fact, when the Houthi took Sana'a, the first thing that happened was the Saudis asked for an audience. They come talk. They will deal. They will deal. They want to make sure that Yemen is not a vulnerability because they're afraid. It's a security risk for them, and so they will deal with the Houthi if the Houthi will deal with them. The thing is, thus far, the answer of the Houthi to the invitation was, when we have the time to give proper respect to the words of the brothers in Riyadh, then we'll come. In other words, we're busy later, and that's what the Saudis did not want. And so they've built up their forces in backing Islah in the tribes in the east, and they may support the Southerners in a successionist move. They're moving in all the ways that the Houthis don't want them to move, and that will exacerbate the tensions inside the country. But they're doing it to open a bargaining to make sure that the Houthi know that they are not the only game in town, that the Saudis have influence. And this is why I see the Eastern Desert conflict as key. Because I would suspect that the Eastern Desert tribes are not going to have the final word in that Saudi Arabia is going to have a big word in the way that's settled, the way that issue where the oil is settled. And that's where the Houthi and Saudi Arabia will begin to trade horses.
And the message that I was being given when I left Yemen in December was loud and clear. The Saudis were looking at the Houthi takeover of the capital, and they were saying, why would we give money to a government where we don't know if they're going to spend that money on arms, say, and then it's going to fall into the Houthis' hands, they're going to use them against us. And number two, these guys need to pay. They need to pay a political price for what they have done. And the Saudi position, as I understood it, last I checked, was we're not going to give any money to Yemen. They'd given $4 billion to the country at a minimum since 2012, and it's still broke. And their position is, let's let it happen. We can pay the price of a collapsing Yemeni economy because the Houthis will pay the political price of that collapse.
Do we have time for one question? Okay. A question from the overflow. This is for Mohammed. To what extent are members of the Hirak, that is the Southern Independence Movement, from any faction included in the current negotiations? How are increased calls for independence and certain actions, particularly in Aden, being addressed?
The Houthis, when they moved into the capital, it empowered Hirak. But it seems that Hirak is still stuck at this point where they're fragmented. Their different factions are still competing. They don't have a unified voice. One of the things that made the Houthis a very effective movement is clear leadership, hierarchy, discipline, vision, and goals. And I think the Iraq movement at this point is reacting more than actually working on a plan. And like we mentioned today, there's daily events where there's clashing between Iraq representatives and the military. But the Houthis are trying to work with the Iraqis, but it's not. Everybody's now behind the barrier of security and defending themselves. And we're seeing the country at this point, I'm seeing it evolving into 4 groups. One group is pro-Houthi, another group is anti-Houthi, and then the third group is pro-South, and then the fourth group is like anti the three. Kind of like, we have more challenges, more issues to work on. Why are we still in this political crisis situation?
Let me add one quick thing on that. Recognize that the most of the government officials and most of the military in the South are loyal to Hadi right now. They're loyal to Hadi. So we have kind of a rump government in the South and the East that Hadi has the greatest legitimacy. He became a hero by resigning in all those areas. He has now galvanized the anti-Houthi forces. And the Iraq is outside. The Iraq does not like Hadi. The Iraq sees Hadi as a traitor.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Yes.
Thank you. Ali Salahi, a former diplomat at Yemen embassy. We have a key issue here, is the minority want to demonate the country with a weapon, and they want to impose their agenda and their private interest on the population. We were so close to solve the Yemeni problem through the dialogue and the outcome of the national dialogue. 70 or 80% of the population were with the outcome of the dialogue, were with the 6-region system federalism. And nobody has answered your questions, Mr. Worth, why they don't want the federalism, why Houthis doesn't want federalism. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. The issue of how to divide they're not against the federal state. They're for a federal state, but how the divisions are made, that's the key issue. And that was an issue that was not resolved at the national dialogue. The Southerners, the big issue was the Southerners. The Southerners wanted a division in the 2 former states again, and the North rejected that. They said that's going to lead to secession. And so President Hadi at the end, because nobody could agree on it, he appointed a committee. I think Dr. Yemini was on this. And they made it up. They said, this is what we're going to be. And the regions were definitely designed to, 1, divide the Iraq, so the south went into 2. And the Houthi movement was weakened by it, because Sada was joined with Sana'a, which is a big population center, and cut off from the water access to the Red Sea, and cut off from the Jawf as well. And what they reject is the way it was divided up. And so what they wanted was the ability to amend the draft, and they wanted control over the committee that has the power to amend it. That's what they wanted.
It's also a useful bargaining tool for them with Iraq. And one thing that we've seen since they took over Sana'a is this constant outreach to Iraq on a daily basis, and largely rejection from Iraq. But by addressing the issue of federalism and saying we don't agree with this model, they're also trying to create a position where they can bargain with Iraq, bring them in and say, hey, you get your one region, but you don't get a full-on state.
Yeah. To add one more thing, I think it was also the component of the international community. They're sending a clear message to the international community that the international community was involved in this process, and we're not supportive of this process. Yeah.
Okay. I think that puts an end to it. Thank you so much for coming.
That was great.
That's great.